Hello and welcome to the FanPower Podcast, where we talk about fan engagement through the lens of first and zero-party data. Today, I am joined by my colleague, Adam Armstrong, the COO of FanPower, and Harry Hardy, the Chief Commercial Officer at Major League Rugby. Guys, thanks so much for making the time today.
No worries.
Thanks for having us.
Adam, let's kick it off with your background on rugby. You've grown up in the sport, both on the field and off. Why don't you give the audience a quick background on your life in rugby?
Yeah, happy to. Well, I mean, I've been playing rugby since I was about 4 years old. So I've been involved with rugby a long time. I've got the injuries and body to prove it. And my granddad was president of the local club. My dad was president. I was junior club captain. So I was heavily involved in rugby playing early on. Ended up doing pretty well. Played at a sort of minor league level, essentially, in the UK. And then played for the best club in America in Austin Blacks, out of Austin for a few years. But now I'm very much at the end of my career and I've retired multiple times. And I think this is probably it. But I've been involved with rugby on the sort of non-playing side off and on for a while. When I was at Saatchi in London, we worked with Saracens a little bit. And then when I moved to the US, actually one of the first jobs I got here was because of rugby. A company called Flow Sports out in Austin, Texas. And they were launching their rugby vertical, which is now Flow Rugby. And they needed someone who worked in business who knew something about rugby, and it just was coincidental. We ran into each other, and so I worked for those guys for 5 years, launched Flow Rugby, and then grew it to be one of their fastest growing verticals, and did deals with Sanzar and Six Nations and England Rugby and a bunch of others. Tried to do deals with Major League Rugby for 5 years, didn't manage to do it, unfortunately. Did do some with USA Rugby and acquired their old OTT network and stuff. So been involved a long time, and then obviously left Flow Sports and joined FanPower, and now we're still talking about rugby. So been involved a lot, and met Harry when he was at DC United, actually, because we did a deal with DC United as part of Flow Sports. So Harry and I met there and got on, and then. He happened to take this job, moved to Dallas, and I moved to Dallas, and now we meet up every quarter to have some martinis and oysters and talk about rugby.
Very good. And Harry, you are new to the rugby world on the professional side, but you've been in sport for years now, from Octagon to DC United and now the MLR. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, happy to. And so I definitely nowhere near tough enough to have ever set foot on a rugby pitch. I can tell you that. But now sit as Chief Commercial Officer at Major League Rugby. It's kind of funny how things work out. I like Adam come from the UK and grew up actually more of a soccer or football fan, and golf and cricket were my sports. And my dad would come home from the pub on a Saturday or a Sunday and make me turn over from the golf or cricket and put the rugby on the TV. And so I was forced to kind of learn the game that way, and found out years later it was because he had a bet on the games. So it's funny, I never thought I'd work in rugby, but took this role about 18 months ago. To drive the commercial efforts for the league, and it's been an incredible 18 months, and we've got a lot of work ahead of us. But the opportunity to join a new league, or fairly new, we're in our 6th season now, but join a new league of a sport that I know and grew to love over my childhood and early years. And we've got a real chance of being a significant sports property here in the US. So my role is, again, everything commercial, mostly focused on our national sponsorships and media partners and sports betting and anything connected to the commercial and revenue side. But before I was here, as Adam mentioned, I was at DC United as Executive Vice President of Business Operations. I joined that organization right after they just opened Audi Field, which is the new stadium that they play in now, in Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. And My remit initially was to create an events business for that building. Other than the 20 MLS games that we would play a year, we wanted to monetize the building, and so started that business for them, and then moved into other things, and eventually oversaw the sponsorship side and marketing and community side of that organization, which was fantastic. And prior to that, had a 12 or 13-year stint at Octagon, the sports agency. Started in our London office, and transitioned over to New York in 2010. That was how I made the jump across the Atlantic, and thought I would stay a year and kind of have an adventure in New York City. And here I am 13 years later in Dallas, Texas, running a rugby league. So
unbelievable. What an awesome story. Sport, in my experience, especially the business of sport, has heavily been driven by relationships for a very long time. And though I'm sure that's a big part of your life still, have you seen data come into play where it was used to just be about relationships, and now it's more about how the consumer or fan data is driving decisions?
I was actually just talking about this today with we work with a sponsorship agency, and we were talking about the old way of selling versus what works today. And I'm old enough to remember the old way of selling, and you would work relationships, and people would trust you, and you would do deals on handshakes, and ultimately they would work out great. But now, data drives everything. And so, when I talk about selling, in this case, I'm talking about, sponsorship sales, that relationship now isn't enough. The buyer, in most cases, the brand, needs to justify the decision to spend the money with that sports property. And if that sports property can't provide them with the data to do that, whether it's ROI data or whether it's presenting a case to them of how you understand your fans through data, all of that is part of the decision-making process, which is completely changes the way you sell, completely changes the way you position your property in a really competitive sports market that is the US.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I know the future of rugby in the US is very bright. The opportunity that you all have, not just from a league perspective, but on the international stage, is very much taking shape. Adam, you want to talk a little bit about kind of the world of rugby and the role the US is playing in it?
Can I, please? Yeah, no, I think it's such a fascinating time to be in your position, Harry, because I mean, for those that don't know, the Rugby World Cup is in the 15s Rugby World Cup, which is the big one, the big form of the game is coming to the US in 2031 and 2033 with the men's and women's. So that's huge, and that's been talked about for a number of years from World Rugby, and World Rugby has seen the US as this huge opportunity, as does the ICC with cricket and other places. But we are now in a position where we're less than 10 years out from 2 Rugby World Cups, and so I'll be interested to understand, Harry, like how has that changed the way you guys are thinking about the league and growth, and has it had an impact since that's been announced on brands coming into the conversation and wanting to be involved despite maybe not having the data there right now that says, hey, we're a huge sport, but they want to get on the bandwagon and be part of that journey?
We certainly have. We definitely are feeling the effect of the announcement to bring the World Cup here. And you said it's the big one, one of the biggest events in global sports coming to the US in 2031 and 2033 with the Women's World Cup as well. And we talk about it seems like every day, and we know that it will benefit our league, but now we've got to figure out how. I think it's almost a given that the event will be a success. I don't want to downplay the amount of work that goes into making it a success, but it's what the US does. It puts on the biggest and the best events in the world. So there'll be a lot of work ahead of us. World Rugby and USA Rugby and ourselves to make sure the event's a success. But it's really, how do you use that that North Star in 2031 to make sure it's not a wasted opportunity, to make sure that the sport succeeds now, in the years before the World Cup and then in the years after it. And that work started, a couple of years ago when we had, some of our owners, had the conversation with USA Rugby and folks should we go get this World Cup? And so it's a constant dialogue. I think how it impacts us today is, you're right. We are seeing a lot of brands that are involved in rugby around the world think about, okay, we've got an 8-year runway to build our presence here in the US. And for us as Major League Rugby, the only professional rugby league here in the US, we hopefully can be the beneficiary of that. But we need to be ready to have high level conversations with these global brands that are used to dealing with tier A properties like a Rugby World Cup. So as a league, it's making us step up our game, making sure we know what we have to offer these brands, and back to that data word, that's been an area that we've really need to focus on, to have the answers to the questions that these brands will have for us both today and in the next 8 years. So there's 10 other or more other ways that this league and this sport will benefit from the World Cup. Obviously, participation is one, and we are, as our 13 teams in Major League Rugby are all focused on that in their individual markets and building infrastructure and pathways to get kids playing, because some of those kids will be on the field in 2031, and those kids will also be a great source of revenue in terms of ticket buying and merchandise and all of that. So we don't have enough time to talk about the opportunity around the World Cup, but just know it's those are the two areas. It's like, how do we as a league position ourselves to benefit from it, and how do we as a sport position ourselves to make sure more people are picking up a rugby ball today and for the next 50 years.
When I was at Flow Sports, and we were looking at the size of the rugby market a lot in the US, trying to understand what that is. And I saw a bunch of different surveys and data that groups had done saying that there was X amount of million fans and all this stuff. And, it's hard to know how reliable that is. But one of the things that you and I have talked about is you launched this OTT network in the rugby network alongside Rugby Pass. And you give away the content for free, so it's not necessarily a revenue driver. Was that really a sort of data play of like, let's get as much access to rugby fans as possible and build that direct relationship with them that we can talk? Like, can you talk through sort of the decision making behind that and how it's progressed and what the future may hold for it?
Yeah, happy to. It's a really interesting one and something I think we're I don't want to say proud of, but it was a tough decision and it was an expensive decision, Adam, as you advised us. It went to start our own OTT platform, but we're already seeing the benefits of it. But initially, the thought process was, if we're going to be one of maybe 50 sports properties on a mainstream streaming network, which I won't name, that, and we don't get any real metrics on who's watching. We don't know who's watching. We don't know where they are. We can't communicate with them. What's the benefit other than, I guess, eyeballs, which is a benefit and is obviously an objective. We need more people watching the sport, but if we're not going to be a priority on someone else's platform, then why don't we create our own? And with that, better understand our audience from a data standpoint and have a direct line of communication with them. And so you're right. Right now, it's free. There's no subscription fee. That could change in the future as the popularity of the league increases. But it gives our 150,000 subscribers a chance to watch all of our games every weekend, and it gives us a chance to know what games they're watching and how long they're watching for, and use data to inform decisions like kickoff times. If a 6 p.m. kickoff time viewership is not as good as, say, an 8 p.m. Maybe that gives us flexibility there. That's just one example. Or where our fans are coming from, how, and then the ability to communicate, have a direct line of communication with them to understand what's important to them. So that was step one, and it's going really well. Now we kind of look at it a little bit differently, and you're right. There's a lot of data that says there's 20 million rugby fans out in the US. Let's just use that as a number. Well, we need to go get those fans, and we need, some of them might be fans of Six Nations or New Zealand rugby or other rugby properties. But how do we pull them into our ecosystem? And we think the Rugby Network can be that. So, you as a rugby fan, Adam, we want you every day to open your browser, as we all do. We get to the office. For me, it's Sky Sports still. We want the rugby fan to rugbynetwork.com. What's happening in the rugby world? What are the highlights from the games this weekend? What are the podcasts? What's the community like? And then whether they're watching Major League Rugby or not, at that point they're in our ecosystem, and we can communicate with them and try and convince them as to why they should watch Major League Rugby, because we know you're a rugby fan. So the potential there is endless. It's a lot of time, a lot of investment, as I mentioned, but key growth strategy for our league and our owners.
Also, yeah, it's interesting. So you really want the Rugby Network to be kind of it's not just about the MLR. It's like the destination for rugby. If you're in the US and you're a rugby fan, or you're interested in rugby at all, the destination is the rugbynetwork.com.
Ultimately, that's where we want to go. Yeah, and right now it's Major League Rugby, all of our games live, highlights, podcasts. We've done some international rights. Collegiate rugby is on there, so like the CRAA Championship this weekend. But ultimately, yeah, we want rugby in this country needs, all of the entities need to come together, I think, to make this a success. And so we hopefully can be a part of that through the Rugby Network.
I've got a question just around, I find it so interesting when leagues or sports that have such a strong international presence make their move into the U.S. And there's clearly going to be international brands that follow, right? Like Guinness is a big sponsor of Six Nations, right? So they're also a well-known brand here in the States. And so I guess my two questions are, first, do international brands, in your experience, view data differently than American brands? That's my first question. And then as a follow-on, do you see a difference in the interest in rugby between the international brands that have the experience and the American brands that maybe want to be a part of the momentum that you're driving?
Yeah, on the first question, Dan, I've been removed from the UK market for a while, so it's hard for me to comment on what's happening internationally, I guess. But I'm almost seeing the opposite in terms of do they treat data differently? I almost feel like, and this is totally anecdotal, but I feel like other markets around the world, because the scale is not quite the same as the US, maybe have to be a little more savvy than we've had to, because we've somewhat been spoiled with the scale and again, this is the greatest sports market in the world. But other, smaller scale countries might have to be a little more savvy, understand their data. But we've got to play catch up quickly, and I think the sports industry in general has to. I think you compare it to retail and other industries that have been doing this for decades. We've got to play catch up, and obviously that's what you guys are in the middle of. So, I think it's something, and I'll be honest. I'm somewhat of a data convert, I guess. Again, I'm not necessarily a technical guy, but I've found myself, especially in this role, because we're a challenger property. We're an up and comer. We need to be different. We need to provide a different value to prospective brands. Data is where we've gone. Of course, we talk about our product in rugby and our athletes and the markets we're in and all of the other differentiators we think we have. But data is now something I'm talking about every single day, which was just not the case, even 2 years ago, 5 years ago. So that, I kind of took that down a rabbit hole. I can't even remember your second question, Dan. But
I'm interested in the are a lot of the brands following rugby over from overseas to tap into the American market, or are you seeing more of the American brands, jumping on a property if they don't maybe have the budget or the relationship or the access to some of the other leagues?
It's more so. When I got here, I of course thought, who are the brands we should talk to? It's all of the brands that are spending money in rugby globally. That's the first target list that you have, and then you quickly learn that the US office, while they know that, say, the UK office is doing things in rugby, the US office doesn't have, let's say, a rugby strategy, and we know that. We're quite open about that. Not many brands in the US woke up this morning thinking, hey, we need to have a rugby strategy. They haven't had that option, candidly, in the past. And so, not many brands 15 years ago, 20 years ago had a soccer strategy in this country either. And so we recognize that. So we're not seeing, or at least we weren't seeing, the influx of international brands looking to get involved with our league and our sport. That's changing slightly with the World Cup conversation, for sure. But where we've had success as a league is more on the US brands who recognize us as an up and coming property, who want to be part of something that's growing, that want to get in early. Again, back to data, we have a really compelling story around our fan data and how avid fans rugby are, and how avidly they support the brands spending money in rugby, and what our fan looks like from a household income and all of that. And so we're holding our own. We're more than holding our own. We're growing year on year in terms of sponsorships with just US brands, because we feel like we have a good product. And when we get those brands in the door, we're over delivering value for them. Again, back to data, we show them the data that we work with a third party that provides a media value for all of our sponsors, and we share it with the sponsor. We say, look, you paid us as X, and we're delivering Y, and the Y is in most cases 2 to 3 times what they paid in terms of an investment.
I love that. Yeah. And just going back to the opportunity to access the pipeline of rugby players that you're kind of creating or guiding. I mean, I remember growing up, it was absolutely not a sport that was offered to youth in my area. I grew up in the Northeast. Now, if you go anywhere in the Northeastern corridor, from New Hampshire down to where I am, on the shore in New Jersey, we've got 3 or 4 local youth rugby clubs. And if you're a brand, you've got to be thinking about tapping into like that. I mean, it's a smart long-term play, right? Because they're going to associate it with their childhood and now growth.
Yeah. Just one on that, I do not have, the data to back this up, but I would bet that there's more rugby clubs in the US than any country in the world. And it gets back to, and Adam's smiling, he might disagree with me, but when you combine rugby clubs and universities or colleges, I just think based on scale, I think we would certainly be up there. And so, our goal, which is great, our goal now is to bring them to Major League Rugby, but then also provide pathways for kids to go into those clubs and teams and then play ultimately in our league. And we use our 13 teams to do that within their respective markets.
Well, for what it's worth, I mean, it may have something to do with my association with Adam, but my son had a rugby ball before he had a football, and he's 2. So.
I love it.
Quite right. I wonder whether that's a really fascinating thought. Like, if there is that, it could be just due to the scale. You could be right. I'm interested, like, how you guys think about growing the sport now, because in the past, I've had conversations with people in rugby, and they've said we don't really. There's rugby fans, but we don't really need to worry about them because they're rugby fans. What we really need to worry about is converting fans of other sports to be rugby fans. And, I always thought that's an interesting point of view. But if and we don't really know, part of the problem, I suppose, is that we don't really know how many rugby fans are in the US. Like the numbers really vary. But surely you're better off focusing on getting the base and getting people who are rugby fans like really excited about Major League Rugby before trying to convert someone who's a football fan or a basketball fan. Because I always felt like all these sports that aren't American sports see the US as this huge sort of cash cow and huge opportunity. But what they don't realize is that this is the most competitive sports market in the world. Like, people are not sat around twiddling their thumbs wondering what to do on a weekend or a Friday night, or whatever. They're watching, all kinds of different sports. And so, if you're going to convert someone to be a rugby fan from a different sport, either they have to have the time to watch that as well, or to give up their sport that they're watching, right? And so just interested how you guys think about that. Are you thinking about new fans, or are you thinking about, let's get everyone who's ever been associated with rugby, let's get them being fans first?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's the question we ask ourselves pretty much every day, and not to cop out answering, but the answer is both. And I'll tell you what. And when I got here, again, being open, I thought it was, we got to we've got to bring people to the sport and convert people to be rugby fans to grow. And I think that ultimately that is true in the long term. But I don't think we have captured all of the rugby fans yet in the US, and I actually think our league, is sustainable by capturing all the rugby. I do think there's enough of them here, back to scale, back to we've got to go find them because they exist, but we've got to find them and bring them in. And I think we can have a successful sports property by doing that. But ultimately, for us to get to where we want to get to, which is, to be the sixth biggest sports league here in the US, we do need to bring in, people who would consider themselves non-rugby fans. So it's hard, where do you prioritize? And again, it's a balance we talk about every day. But I think if we continue to do the fundamentals really well, which is creating incredible experiences in our stadiums, being great partners within our community. Our athletes are incredible. There are, Adam, you've been around rugby your whole life. I've been around other sports, and rugby players by far and away are the best athletes to work with, just from a personality and the values they live by, and the respect they have for the game and the opponent and the rules. And so our athletes are a big tick. Our product is a big tick. It's fast. It's quick. These athletes are built for speed and strength. So our product's good. Our athletes are good. We're in really good markets. Let's continue to focus on the fundamentals of being a really good kind of sports and entertainment property. And I think people will cross over the aisle and become rugby fans. The part that does need to complement doing the fundamentals right is raising awareness around the league, and the fact that there is a professional rugby league here, the fact that it's a very high standard of rugby, globally speaking. That's the part that we really need to focus on, just making people aware that we're here. And if we keep doing the right things and the fundamentals, I think they'll find us. And when they do, I think they'll fall in love with the sport.
You can tell Harry's relatively new to rugby because he calls the laws rules. He's like, rugby's funny. Everyone that always gets brought up. You call they're the laws of rugby.
Well, I feel like you and I are stuck in no man's land because we've both been here long enough where I don't necessarily feel English anymore, but I'm not American either. So do I say pitch, or do I say field? Do I say match, or do I say game? Do I say laws? Do I say rules? Yeah, we're doomed.
Someone asked me that the other day, if it was match or game in rugby. I was like, I can't even remember anymore.
Yeah, I don't remember.
I certainly call it soccer now instead of football as well.
Well, with that, that's a pretty good transition. I mean, we're excited about the future of the MLR. My exposure to rugby over the last probably 5 or 6 years has turned me onto the sport, and as a result, really going back to the things you mentioned, the values and the true teamwork element of it, like the amount of things that you learn as a rugby player. And I've learned this, secondary through Adam and everything he's kind of told me about growing up. Like those are amazing values, things that are hard to find. And so it's great to hear that the athletes do represent that. Transitioning kind of into the final question that I like to ask people on this podcast. It's really interesting to ask you because you're, really driving momentum and creating a new brand around a sport that is relatively new to most Americans. Outside of rugby, either on the startup league or a sport that is being brought from abroad, is there anything that you are particularly excited about in the sports world?
Outside of rugby?
Yes. Knowing rugby is your first.
Yeah, that's a good one. How do I answer this without helping some of our competition? There's a lot of, Adam said it earlier, this is the most competitive sports market in the world. It's been really interesting to, we kind of call ourselves a challenger league, I guess is the term we use, but it's been interesting to see them. Some other properties come up. Obviously, the pickleball movement has been phenomenal. I, like everyone, picked that up during COVID, and it's been fun to watch the growth there. And I know some of the people involved with that organization. So that one's interesting. I'm really interested to see how that translates into a TV product. I'm still not quite clear on that, but eagerly watching that. What else? Obviously, there's a lot of competition in golf right now. That's a sport I love. For good or bad, there's a ton of competition there, and I think ultimately it's helped. The PGA Tour change its model, and so that's going to be fascinating to watch over the next 2 or 3 years. But yeah, that's kind of where my head is. And Dan, you kind of put me on the spot. It's like we need to remember to be sports fans. We're so close to it. And sport is a passion. We all chose to work in sport because we love it and the people around it. And I always say if we wanted real jobs, we'd have worked harder in school. But we need to remember to be sports fans and enjoy it for what it is rather than just a business. But yeah, it's an interesting question.
That's great. Well, for what it's worth, in the first episode, I asked that question, and they shot it back at me. And my answer was rugby. So,
amazing!
I'm excited about it, and I think it's a really good thing. I think it's going to change a lot of people's fandom, and I think it's going to be something that people can play at all ages, and it's going to create a really great culture here in the U.S.
We think so too.
Do I get to answer that question as well? Since I've
I didn't even think about that, Adam. Outside of FanPower, what are you most excited about?
I don't think of anything except FanPower nowadays. I actually, my answer will be one that I thought Harry would have given, which is the Major League Cricket movement. And it's relevant as well because obviously they're basing themselves in Dallas which is another question that we were going to ask you, but it's interesting because they're playing certainly their first season. Everyone is coming to Dallas. They're building a stadium just outside of Dallas, which should be finished, I think, by July when the competition is. And there's teams from different places. My favorite team, I think it's San Francisco Unicorns, which is a phenomenal name. Which I actually have a friend a mutual friend of Harry and I's that's playing for. So I'm looking forward to seeing him in pink and blue. But it's an interesting one because cricket is such a massive sport globally, and there's so much money in it as well. And it definitely, and I suppose in one sense, competition for you guys at Major League Rugby. But I suppose being English, we don't see rugby and cricket as too much competition because they're played at different times of the year. So. But I think that's really fascinating. The different models to the MLR and basing everyone and playing all the games in Dallas. But I know there's a lot of money coming into it. They've raised a lot of money. There's a lot of ownership groups from like the IPL over in India and places like that who are getting involved. So I think they're going to probably grow pretty quickly. They brought in a lot of interesting athletes, and they believe there's a huge amount of cricket fans in the US already. that love watching it. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that goes. The first event is in July. So we get out there and watch some of that. Nothing better than sitting in 100-degree heat watching a game of cricket, different to watch it in England. But yeah, that would be my answer. And we'll see how they do.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'm interested to see that.
Fantastic. Well, Harry, thank you for joining us. Appreciate the insight. I think you actually drove us back to data in the conversation during this, where we were just trying to talk about rugby. So clearly it is top of mind and a big part of what you're doing. We're excited to see you grow and excited to kind of see the MLR take over and create a new rugby culture here in the States. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the support of our league, and thanks for having me on today. We appreciate it. Keep up the good work.